Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I would like to thank especially the colleagues who took the trouble to provide translation and other help. I really appreciate that. Scholars and practitioners alike have argued, probably since the earliest days of Buddhism, about the best ways to articulate the central teaching of Buddhist traditions. Discussions which sometimes, but not always, are cast in terms of the central teaching of the Buddha Shakyamuni. From a scholarly point of view, it is clear that, whatever the teachings of the Buddha Shakyamuni may have been, there were many and often profound changes and evolutions over the course of the 2,500 years of the history of Buddhism. Therefore, in different times and places, different topics were considered more central or received more attention. Some points, however, could probably be generally agreed upon as important. Throughout Buddhist communities from earliest times, there has been common agreement that life in the world, life in our world, is life in samsara, the beginningless cycle of transmigration. That is, all living beings experience a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Our present life is only one in an unimaginably vast series of such lives. Though this cycle is beginningless, it is not endless. According to tradition, what the Buddha taught was a way to become free of this imprisoning cycle, a way to end the cycle of samsara. One, though not the only, term for this freedom is nirvana. This then forms one fundamental pair in Buddhist thought, samsara and nirvana. Another highly influential idea is that it is essential to purify one's mind, though certainly not all Buddhist traditions would articulate the idea in exactly these terms. What holds beings, the tradition would say all beings, though in fact the focus is nearly entirely on human beings, to the cycle of transmigration is karma, that is, actions and their results. What is most important about karma for Buddhists, and this sets them apart from some other Indian religious traditions, is that action is defined as intention. In other words, what holds human beings to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is that we act with intention. What does intention mean here? Intention means acting oriented toward a goal. We want to gain something. This, it is important to say immediately, is certainly not only positive. What we gain can also be negative. For example, we can aim to gain freedom from pain. We can aim, that is, at the absence of pain, a negative state. So we are trapped in repeated cycles of samsara because we act with intention. We want things, both to bring certain things close toward ourselves and to push other things far away from ourselves. We want to gain possession of the desirable and gain freedom from the non-desirable. Buddhist texts often speak of these two extremes with a pair of terms, lust and hatred, though the categories are much vaster than these categories might suggest. Given this analysis, it should be clear that the path toward freedom from samsara requires that we, that humans, learn to act without such intentions, without the idea that we acquire something through our actions, whether that acquisition be positive or negative. This is our only way forward, because we certainly cannot stop acting altogether. Let us remember that even if we were to decide to stop acting, such as by sitting in a corner with our eyes closed, not eating, not speaking, and so on, the only result would be our physical death. But then we, that is to say, our identity, who we are, would simply be reborn, and the entire cycle would begin again. There is clearly no way to avoid acting per se. Therefore, given the fact that conceptions of profit from actions bind us to samsara, the only remaining course is to act without intention. How then does intention work? Intention, as I said, is end-oriented action. I act with the idea of gaining some result. But who gains that result? I do. I myself, no one else. When I act, even if I act toward another, only I receive karmic results of my actions. If I help an elderly person across the street, I acquire a good karmic seed, as Buddhist technical language would term it. But the elder whom I help does not thereby acquire any karma. Why is this so important? It is crucial because we have then reduced the problem to the intention of action to this I, to the self, as Buddhist tradition teaches. Next comes one of the most crucial steps in our chain of reasoning. I believe that I act for some benefit for myself. This belief is what makes my actions intentional, and therefore what produces karma. And the production of that karma is what binds me to continued rebirth. But what is this I for the benefit of which I am acting? When we try to locate an I, we discover that there is no unique, independent, unchanging, essential, and identifiable entity that could be understood as I, me, or myself. When one understands not only intellectually but entirely the reality that there is no self, understands the fact that no I actually independently exists, then one understands that it is impossible to act for one's own benefit. The action exists, certainly, but there can be no real recipient of the intention. And again, acting without intention is the only way to stop the creation of karma, the results of which hold us in the cycle of samsara. The only path toward freedom from samsara, in this understanding, runs through the dissolution of the idea of the existence of an I. That is, through the dissolution of the illusion that I exist. This is rather dense reasoning, though it lies at the heart of virtually all versions of the Buddhist teaching. But now we come to the key point. How do we come to understand that it is, in reality, actually not possible to act intentionally? The logic runs that acting intentionally is to act for some gain, and gain by definition means acting in a manner that brings a benefit for the actor. But the erasure of the self, the recognition that there is no actually existent self, means that it is not actually possible to act intentionally. Understanding reality correctly, understanding the fact of no self, means that one cannot act for the benefit of oneself. This recognition of the reality of the non-existence of self is termed by Buddhist traditions wisdom. And now I hope you can understand why I've begun my presentation with this doctrinal sketch. For wisdom is one of the key terms of today's meeting. The 5th Seoul International Meditation Expo is dedicated today to the theme of meditation and wisdom. From my perspective, this pair of terms, meditation and wisdom, lies as one of the most central dynamics of Buddhist tradition. And I will explain in a few moments why I've titled my own presentation From Meditation and Wisdom to Chanting and Wisdom. That will come later. In Indian Buddhist literature is not only the texts of monastic discipline, the Vinaya, but also the scriptures of sutra and treatises, shastra, which very clearly were composed with a monastic audience in mind. While in later Buddhist traditions of East Asia, non-monastics also came to study the scriptures in particular, in India there is no evidence that this was the case. And as for the treatises, the theoretical works of Buddhist theology, so to speak, I believe it is only in modern times that non-monastics came to read and study these works. This question of audience will become important in a few moments. For us, therefore, when we struggle to understand what is written in these holy books of Indian Buddhism, whether we are laypersons or monastics ourselves, we must begin our attempts by adopting the point of view of monastics. Now, it is certainly true that considerable attention is given in many Buddhist scriptures to meditation, and there is no question that meditation was understood in general to be a valuable means of access to wisdom. I am sure that many other speakers will discuss aspects of this dynamic. My approach will generally perhaps be a little different, but I feel it will be helpful to begin with some background. The early corpus of treatises of theoretical Buddhist texts is termed in Sanskrit the Abhidharma, and this is the genre that later became expanded into a broad collection of commentaries and independent works, the Shastras or Lun. The early conception was that the Buddha presented his teachings in his sermons, collected in sutras, in an unsystematic way. The Buddha preached, according to the tradition, to suit the situation of his audience in each individual case, and the corpus of scriptures preserves certain instances of these preachings. As a result, the scriptures are not overall presented in a systematic way. Therefore, to simply study the Buddha's sermons, the scriptures, presents a great challenge, since in order to obtain an overview, one would have to extract from these diverse presentations a coherent system. But this task was accomplished already long ago within the tradition itself. Those scholars who compiled the Abhidharma undertook, that is, to carry out this task of extraction and organization. The result is that it is possible for us to imagine the Abhidharma as a map of the vision of reality as sketched by the Buddha in his sermons. We might think of the situation as follows. If I take a journey, I might write a diary of the individual days of my journey. But if I write those notes on note cards, and the cards are not preserved in order, someone will have to come along and put them in order to produce a map of my journey. We could think of the Abhidharma as similar to this creation of a map. Why is this important for us now? If the Abhidharma systematizes the Buddha's picture of reality, and if understanding reality is essential to learning how to act without intention, and subsequently to become free of samsara, then the Abhidharma can provide the necessary guidance for anyone who wants to attain this goal, namely, to attain nirvana. How does this bring us to meditation? This topic is complex, and I will present it in only a superficial manner here. But roughly speaking, and finally we come to meditation, there are two approaches to meditation in Indian Buddhist traditions, namely those called in Sanskrit shamatha and vipassana. The former refers to calming, the latter to insight. As I said, this is overly simplified, but for our purposes, it will suffice to understand that it is necessary in the first place to settle the mind. One of my favorite images of the mind is that it is like a monkey, namely that just as a monkey swings from branch to branch among the trees, so the mind jumps around from object to object constantly. In other words, it is very difficult, at least for the untrained mind, to concentrate. There's good evidence that originally it was not imagined that one would first engage in calming practice and then only later in insight. But this idea seems to have developed and came to dominate the tradition. Be that as it may, this brings us back to the Abhidharma and its maps of reality. For what is the point of insight meditation? It is to develop within oneself the same understanding of the nature of reality as that attained by the Buddha, such that one will ultimately understand the fictional nature of the self and the true nature of reality. Now, whenever one sets out on a journey, one requires a map to tell one where to go. Nowadays, we rely on Google Maps, but I grew up with paper maps and atlases, and thinking of these objects might be slightly more helpful. Because while Google Maps actively tells one what to do, when to turn, when to go straight, without one having to plan much or make strategic decisions, a map or atlas requires the traveler to study the route in advance and actively decide how to proceed. This small difference aside, if one is on a journey, or let us say a journey, at least a journey with a specific goal, one needs to know what lies ahead in order to know how to proceed. The map of reality which guides the meditator who seeks to understand the nature of reality is that map provided by the teaching of the Buddha as systematized in the Abhidharma. We might, going back to the image above, imagine that the Buddha in his sermons, in his sutras, gave indications about specific small parts of the journey, while the task undertaken by the scholars who compiled the Abhidharma was to take all those small route advisories and put them together into a universal atlas. Therefore, for insight meditation, the Abhidharma offers a roadmap of the journey that one wishes to take, and that roadmap offers the seeds of the wisdom which help one to proceed. In Mahayana Buddhist traditions, there are somewhat different concepts deployed to refer to this roadmap, and the insight is understood in somewhat different terms, for example, using the concept of emptiness. But I think that generally speaking, the basic message is the same. The fundamental meaning of emptiness is absence of self, such that a true understanding of emptiness, which is called wisdom, is equivalent to the true understanding of non-self. Now, there is no question that Buddhist traditions and Buddhist textual sources have devoted much attention to both the theory and the practice of meditation. Authors of East Asian traditions, such as the Tiantai and Huayan, not to mention the Chan school, have offered elaborate theories refining and expanding basic Indian insights and providing how-to manuals for meditation practices. While there's a great deal to say about these traditions and the connection of meditation and wisdom in various traditions, in my remarks today, I would like to discuss a somewhat different approach. Indian Buddhist texts, as I mentioned a few moments ago, were composed with an intended audience of monastics, monks and nuns. Therefore, one of the questions that they consider is the role of the individual monastic. What should such a person do in his or her monastic life? Now, aside from considering the necessity of administrative roles, some monks, of course, have to actually organize the monastery, make sure that there is bedding for the monks to sleep on, monastic cells for them to put their bedding in, and so on. Monks and nuns are imagined as taking on one of two main roles: meditator or text specialist. There is a great deal to say about what being a meditation specialist might have meant, but for today, I want to leave that aside and leave it to others and think about the other major category, the text specialist. Such specialists no doubt included those who memorized texts and those who expounded and preached them to an audience, as well as those who studied them academically, so to speak. But it is also clear that some, and perhaps even most, of these text specialists are understood to be persons who recite texts. It is unfortunate that we have little information from India about how texts were recited, though we do know that it was a practice. We do not know if it was a common practice, as it was later in East Asia, but certainly it was a practice to memorize texts. What we especially would like to know about India, however, is how texts were recited. And the reason I say this is that we know that in East Asia, it became a practice to chant texts. In fact, when one looks at the daily lives of monks and nuns in most Buddhist institutions of the present day, one finds that a great deal of their time is taken up by chanting. And we need hardly mention that lay practice, the daily or the occasional practice of non-monastic Buddhists, on the whole, consists almost entirely of chanting. Now, there are different types of texts and therefore different forms of recitation and chanting. There is some discussion of the appropriate way to recite the pratimoksha, or the list of monastic rules, which is recited 2 times per month in the monastic assembly, so that all monastics acknowledge that they have not violated the rules. Furthermore, at least later in the tradition, there are texts called stotra or stava in Sanskrit, hymns of praise, and these are often highly poetical texts which would be recited as poetry. This, further, is not to mention famous texts such as the Buddha Charita of Ashvaghosha or the Bodhicharya Avatara of Shantideva. Here, we are not very concerned with such literature, but rather instead with scriptures, and especially a particular genre, which I will come to in a moment. For it is clear that ritual recitation, whether through chanting or otherwise, is important in Buddhist traditions. For me, all this raises a question. What possible role does chanting play in the attainment of progress in the Buddhist path? Put in other words, if we accept, as I generally think we do, that within Buddhist frameworks, it is nearly universally believed that a central path towards spiritual progress runs through the practice of meditation, can we also say that the even more common practice of chanting likewise leads to such progress? Let us now take a step backwards and remember that we, perhaps too quickly, mentioned that there are 2 kinds of meditation, calming and insight. It is generally felt, as I mentioned, that calming precedes insight, that the former does not have intellectual content while the latter does. In other words, calming meditation aims to quiet the mind and serves as a preparation for the analytical activity of insight meditation. But this opinion is certainly not universal, by which I mean that not everyone thinks that insight meditation is essential. Let us consider for a moment the role of calming meditation, and let us connect this with chanting. Can we understand chanting to be essentially equivalent to calming meditation? And what then might be the connection between calming and wisdom? This discussion could become quite technical, so I will offer a brief suggestion. Although they often articulate it in different terms, most Buddhist traditions understand ultimate reality to be obtained by the mind having unmediated access to the ultimate. In other words, the mind, when free of delusions and defilement, free of lust and hatred and confusion, the so-called 3 poisons, directly confronts reality as it is. Calming meditation is understood not only as a precursor step to insight meditation, but also on its own, so to speak, as a direct path to rendering the mind pure and unobstructed. The mind is often understood in Buddhist rhetoric as a mirror, and the mirror, par excellence, is a completely placid body of water, a pond, for instance, without a single ripple on its surface. This is precisely the imagery that corresponds to the goal of calming meditation. This calming is attained typically by seated meditation and other similar techniques, but also, I would suggest, by another form of Buddhist practice. If we are concerned with chanting, Where would we look in Buddhist India? One answer lies in the extremely large corpus of texts which are commonly called Dharani Sutras. These are scriptures which contain formulas, dharani, which, while they are in Sanskrit, have a mythical or a mystical meaning which transcends their language. In many ways, we might think of them as very close to the more familiar mantra, a syllable or string of syllables thought to be endowed with mystical properties. When such texts were translated into Tibetan and Chinese, the dharani were transcribed because it was the sound and not any possible meaning that was considered important and powerful. These texts commonly advocate the almost endless repetition of their particular dharani, some of which are relatively short, some of which can be quite lengthy. As the dharani are not meant to be sensible, what this requires of the practitioner is the memorization of a meaningless series of sounds. In fact, this is quite similar or even identical to what takes place when contemporary Koreans or Japanese, or of course Europeans, recite Buddhist texts in Chinese. The Chinese language in which the translation of, for example, the Heart Sutra or the Amituo Jing are written is not understandable to most untrained Korean or Japanese Buddhists, not to mention Europeans. And therefore, the practice of recitation of such texts is essentially the same as the recitation of a dharani. There is as yet very little serious study of recitation or chanting and trance in Buddhism. But I think it is a very promising hypothesis to suggest that ritual chanting can induce the same sort of mental concentration as that achieved in some forms of meditation, particularly calming meditation. Sorry. Calming meditation, in which what is aimed at is the removal of the discursivity of mind. Why is it then that Buddhist dharani texts do not list wisdom as among the positive results of the ritual recitation of dharani? What they offer instead is a list of very material benefits, which, however, one will achieve only in the life to come, that is, after death in one's subsequent birth. The reason for this seems obvious to me, namely, that if I were to promise you some result in the present life, you could easily see whether this would come true or not. But no one can know what will happen in the next life. And the promised results listed in the sutras might seem somewhat surprising to us if we are looking forward to abstract spiritual gifts. In exchange, so to speak, for the ritual recitation of the dharani, the scriptures promise the practitioner a future life of good health, long life, wealth, having an attractive appearance, freedom from negative rebirths, such as hell or as an animal, as well as a number of accomplishments generally thought to be reserved for those of advanced spiritual attainments, such as having memory of one's previous lives. The last is particularly important since having memory of previous lives makes it possible for one to directly observe the truth of the workings of karma. One sees precisely which actions in the past led to which results. There is more, however. A number of texts maintain that the actual content of the dharani is the essential teaching of the Buddha, however much it might appear superficially that it is nothing other than a sequence of nonsense syllables. A number of texts elaborate on this essential insight in quite some detail and in very technical terms. In sum, we can say that for some texts, mastery of the dharani is equivalent to the mastery of the entirety of the Buddha's teachings. But what then is mastery of the dharani? It is nothing other than its complete internalization, something achieved by repeated practice of recitation, chanting, if you will. This leads us to the conclusion that ritual, mantric-like recitation of even superficially nonsense texts is seen as a vital and powerful path toward awakening. The same appears to be true, moreover, for recitations of texts which could have conventionally understandable content, such as the earlier mentioned Heart Sutra and Amitabha, the latter the most popular Amitabha scripture in East Asia. How might this work? Now, I am not a specialist of cognitive sciences, as are some other speakers, and therefore I base what I say in the following on what I have read in the work of experts in the field. It will be well known to you that considerable attention has been given to the study of mental states of meditators, with the use of fMRI, EEG, and so on. However, as far as I can see, almost no attention has been given to chanting, and the few studies I have seen appear to have serious and indeed essentially fatal methodological problems. One basic problem with such studies, it seems to me, is that they are willing to alter natural conditions in order to make their experiments possible. For instance, it is not uncommon to read of meditators placed inside MRI machines. Now, it is well known that many traditions maintain that the strict physical posture of meditation is essential, relating this to ideas about the flow of prana or chi, in any event, the flow of bodily energy. However, it is impossible to be seated inside an MRI scanner, and so the subjects are examined lying down. I am not aware of this being discussed, although, as I said, I am not a specialist in the field, so perhaps I have simply overlooked it. When it comes to chanting, things are also problematic. One Japanese study attempted to examine the utility of Buddhist chanting on those experiencing grief. Except, of course, it is impossible to plan to have grieving people available for your study, and also doubtless unethical. So the authors of the study artificially induced grief. I consider the results of such a study essentially useless. All this said, we must then conclude that at the present we are very hard-pressed to make progress scientifically with the study of the effects of ritual chanting. But we can at least identify groups which might in future be studied. And these include those who ritually recite the Daimoku, that is to say, the title of the Lotus Sutra, as promoted by Nichiren traditions, the repeated utterance of the expression Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. A close parallel to this is the ritual recitation of the name of the Buddha Amitabha, namely in Japanese Namu Amida Butsu. Further, the entire Heart and Amitabha Sutras are also ritually recited, the latter in devout households at least 2 times every day, morning and evening, by lay persons. In temples, the liturgical days are filled with recitations. Here we must make an important observation. Up until now, we have assumed that the recitation in question is performed by the practitioner, but this is, of course, not always the case. Every morning in Nichiren sect temples, for example, significant portions of the Lotus Sutra are recited by the monk or monks of the temple. And these recitations can be, and often are, attended by the devout lay community. While they may have in hand the Chinese text the monks are chanting, with accompanying indications of the pronunciation of each character, their interaction can often be passive, so to speak. And this is an important consideration. While there is no passive interaction with meditation, that is, no one watches monks meditate, we need to devote attention to the fact that some or even many of those involved in recitation or chanting do not perform the chanting themselves, but serve, as it were, as an audience. This is exemplified by the existence of mechanical devices which perform recorded chants, one variety of which are called in Chinese nianfuoji. I think on the PowerPoint there is a picture of one. Nianfuo machines, or Buddha's name recitation machines. These are essentially small speakers with an endless loop of chantings or recitations. Typologically, we might certainly compare them to the so-called prayer wheels, which also mechanically reproduce the action which is said to produce merit or spiritual benefit to the faithful. I will not speculate whether, and if so, how, passively listening to someone else's recitation or chanting is meant to produce spiritual progress, although certainly many in the Buddhist tradition would strongly insist that it can and does. Rather, I would like to return to the central topic, namely wisdom. I would like to suggest, in closing my remarks, that the focus entirely on meditation, to the apparent exclusion of other forms of Buddhist practice, such as chanting, may be too narrow. There is no question that meditation, in all its vast variety of forms, has been held by Buddhist traditions essentially from the beginning to be the key means to attain wisdom, that is, to attain the insight which will free one from one's bondage. At the same time, however, there has been a recognition within the tradition that this is not the only path. One difference in the modern world might be that meditation has been widely understood, perhaps since the 1960s in the West, as a not necessarily religious practice. And there are many today who promote the practice of various forms of meditative cultivation as a secular practice. This allows those who do not wish to be identified with religion to nevertheless engage in meditation without feeling they are compromising their secular commitment. At the same time, if persons are firm in their commitment to a non-Buddhist religion, they too may nevertheless engage in Buddhist-derived meditation practices if they are convinced that these practices are not in conflict with their own religious commitments. Something possible if they deem Buddhism to be a non-religion. It might be possible, indeed there is ample evidence that it is possible, to engage in Buddhist meditation while not identifying oneself as a Buddhist believer. This sort of dissociation is much more difficult with chanting practice. One can hardly commit to the ritual recitation of the name of Amida Buddha, for instance, if one does not have a faith commitment to the so-called Pure Land traditions. And one cannot recite the Daimoku, or chant portions of the Lotus Sutra, without a parallel faith commitment. This may be the reason that considerations of meditation practices tend to predominate over those of recitation when reaching out to those without a Buddhist faith commitment. Finally, I hope with my short presentation today to have suggested a possible widening of the attention heretofore given centrally to meditation as the primary avenue for the acquisition of wisdom. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your lecture. 제가 사전 접수를 받으면서 당시 몇 가지 질문들도 함께 선정을 해 두었는데요. 그 질문은 이제 강연에서 언급을 해주신 사마타 그리고 또 윗바사나 명상법들이 현대의 자기 발전이나 개인 성장과 어떻게 연관되어 있는지 제가 질문을 드려보겠습니다.
The question that was asked in the email is, in your presentation, you discussed the significance of meditation, especially calming shamatha and insight vipassana practices in cultivating wisdom and understanding the non-existence of self? How do you believe these meditation practices relate to or contribute to contemporary ideas of self-discovery and personal growth? And what I would like to say about this is that I think it's a bit narrow in the following way, that this way of asking the question imagines that personal growth is something that happens in isolation from a community. And as if one meditated by oneself and everything that one did was in isolation from the society and from one's, let's say, friends and family and coworkers and so forth. And this is a point where I think that consideration of chanting and ritual recitation can be very important, that even if one participates in a meditation group, one's experience is entirely internal. But by participating in a chanting exercise, one is able to be part of a community. And this is something in terms of self-cultivation that I think really should not be forgotten, that at least, I can only speak for myself, I would say, but it seems to me that one of the most important points of human development is to get along with other persons. And that requires both internal cultivation, but also actively working to interact with others in a community way. And I think all of us probably know personally individuals who spend a lot of time meditating, but are not particularly nice people and not particularly nice to be around. And it seems to me that this is, of course, this is not universal by any means, but it can be a kind of side effect of meditation that one becomes too internally focused. And I think that thinking about other kinds of practices that necessitate interaction with other people is extremely important for, let's say, cultivation and in all meanings of self-cultivation.